Before we dive into this story, subscribe to the channel and click the like button. It's a small gesture with a big impact. And tell me, where are you listening from? The rain fell in steady sheets against the window of Mrs. Pemberton's dressmaking establishment, blurring the gas-lit streets of Bloomsbury into watercolor streaks of amber and shadow. Eleanor Hartley's fingers moved with practiced precision across ivory silk, her needle catching the lamplight as she worked the delicate embroidery that would transform this fabric into something extraordinary. It was 10:30 in the evening, and she had been working since dawn, but she could not afford to stop. The commission was due in 3 days, and Mrs. Pemberton had entrusted her with the most intricate pieces, a responsibility Eleanor never took lightly. Around her, the workroom lay quiet and dim. The other seamstresses had departed hours ago, leaving behind the faint scent of tea and the whisper of fabric scraps scattered across cutting tables. Eleanor preferred these solitary hours. In the silence, she could lose herself in the rhythm of her craft, creating beauty that would grace the shoulders of women who would never know her name. Her back ached from hours bent over her work, and her eyes strained in the insufficient light, but her hands never faltered. She had learned long ago that survival required steadiness, that complaint was a luxury she could not afford. The gown taking shape before her was a masterpiece of understated elegance, pale blue silk with pearl beading that caught light like morning dew. It was destined for Lady Catherine Montague, who would wear it to some grand event without a single thought for the woman who had poured her soul into every stitch. Eleanor had grown accustomed to this invisible existence. She was 37 years old, unmarried, and possessed of no fortune or family name that society deemed worthy of notice. She was, by every measure that mattered to London's elite, a woman of no consequence. But Eleanor's hands could create magic. She understood fabric the way musicians understood notes, how silk whispered against skin, how velvet absorbed light, how the perfect cut could transform a body into art. Mrs. Pemberton's establishment had flourished because of Eleanor's talent, though the elderly proprietress took credit for the designs that emerged from Eleanor's imagination. It was an arrangement Eleanor accepted without bitterness. She had a position, modest wages, and a tiny room above a baker's shop in a respectable if unremarkable neighborhood. It was more than many women in her circumstances could claim. The bell above the shop door chimed, jarring Eleanor from her concentration. She glanced at the clock, nearly 11, far too late for customers, and Mrs. Pemberton had retired to her rooms hours ago. Eleanor set down her needle and rose, smoothing her simple grey dress as she moved toward the front of the shop. Through the frosted glass of the door, she could make out 2 figures, their silhouettes rendered imposing by the lamplight behind them. Her heart sank as she recognized them. Beatrice Hartley, her stepmother, stood beneath a silk umbrella held by a footman, her face sharp with the perpetual displeasure that seemed to be her natural expression. Even at this late hour, Beatrice was dressed as though attending an evening engagement, her burgundy gown adorned with jet beading that proclaimed her wealth with vulgar insistence. Beside her stood Lavinia, Eleanor's stepsister, a pretty girl of 23 whose porcelain features were marred only by the petulant set of her mouth. Eleanor unlocked the door, keeping her expression carefully neutral. "Beatrice, Lavinia, this is an unexpected visit." "I should think so at such an ungodly hour," Beatrice said, sweeping into the shop without invitation, water dripping from her umbrella onto the wooden floor Eleanor had scrubbed that morning. "But I could not wait another moment to see whether you had managed to avoid ruining Lavinia's ball gown. You understand, I'm sure, that we cannot afford any of your characteristic inadequacies." The insult landed with the precision of long practice, but Eleanor merely inclined her head. "The gown is nearly complete. Would you like to see it?" "Obviously," Lavinia said, her voice carrying that particular tone of bored superiority she had perfected over years of her mother's tutelage. "That is why we've dragged ourselves to this dreary establishment." Eleanor led them to the back workroom, where Lavinia's gown hung on a dressmaker's form near the stove. It was a confection of pale pink silk and cream lace, designed to showcase Lavinia's youth and conventional beauty. Eleanor had labored over it for weeks, creating something that would make her stepsister shine at the upcoming royal ball, an event that had consumed London society's attention for months. Beatrice circled the gown with the assessing eye of a general inspecting troops. "It will do, I suppose, though I had hoped for something more impressive. After all, this is Lavinia's opportunity to catch the eye of one of the 3 dukes. We cannot have her overlooked because her gown lacks distinction." "The design emphasizes Lavinia's natural assets," Eleanor said quietly, Restraint is often more effective than excess. How would you know? Lavinia said with a cruel laugh. You've never attended a ball in your life. You've spent your entire existence in workrooms like this, stitching gowns for your betters, while your own prospects withered away to nothing. Eleanor's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly against her work apron, but her face remained serene. She had learned this discipline over 10 long years, the art of absorbing cruelty without visible reaction, of maintaining dignity when every word was designed to strip it away. Beatrice moved closer to Eleanor, her perfume, expensive and overpowering, filling the small space between them. It is a pity, really. Your father spoiled you dreadfully with all that education, filling your head with literature and languages, as though you were a son, rather than a daughter who needed to secure a husband. And look where it led you. 37 years old alone, working with your hands like a common laborer. Do you know what they say about unmarried women of your age, Eleanor? They say that no gentleman wants them, that they are past their bloom, past their usefulness, destined to fade into obscurity and die forgotten. The words were not new. Beatrice had been delivering variations of this speech since Eleanor's father had died 6 years ago, leaving his modest estate entirely to his second wife through a will that Eleanor suspected had been altered during his final illness. Eleanor had been left with nothing, no inheritance, no protection, no recourse. She had found work with Mrs. Pemberton through a distant family connection, and she had survived through the only currency she possessed, her skill. "I am content with my circumstances," Eleanor said, though even she heard the hollowness in the words. "Content," Beatrice repeated, savouring the word like wine. What a small ambition for a woman who once thought herself destined for better things. But then reality has a way of crushing such delusions, doesn't it? Lavinia, on the other hand, has everything you lacked: youth, beauty, and most importantly, my guidance. By this time next month, she may very well be engaged to a duke. Can you imagine? My daughter, a duchess, while you remain here ruining your eyesight over needlework that no one will remember. Lavinia giggled, the sound high and artificial. Perhaps Eleanor could be my lady's maid, mother. That way she could at least witness what a successful life looks like. An amusing suggestion, darling, though I fear Eleanor lacks the temperament for service. She has always been rather too proud for her station. Beatrice gathered her skirts, preparing to depart. "We will collect the gown Friday morning. I trust it will be ready, and that you will not embarrass us with substandard work. Your father may have tolerated mediocrity, but I certainly will not." They left in a rustle of expensive fabric and self-satisfaction, the bell chiming their departure like a dismissal. Eleanor stood motionless in the workroom for a long moment, listening to the rain and the distant sounds of late-night London, a carriage passing in the street, the watchman calling the hour, the eternal pulse of a city that never truly slept. She returned to her work, picking up the needle with hands that trembled only slightly. Beatrice's words echoed in her mind, not because they were new, but because some part of her had never stopped believing them. She was 37, unmarried, alone. By society's measure, she was a failure, a cautionary tale mothers whispered to daughters about the dangers of pride and education and waiting too long for love. But as Eleanor's needle moved through silk, creating beauty with each precise stitch, she reminded herself of what she had learned in 6 years of solitary survival. She had learned that she was stronger than she had ever imagined. She had learned that contentment could be found in the satisfaction of work well done. She had learned that society's judgment, while painful, could not truly diminish her unless she allowed it to. She had learned that she could survive without love, without family, without any of the things she had once believed essential to happiness. Whether that was strength or merely the slow calcification of hope, she was no longer certain. But it was what she had, and so she continued to sow, creating beauty for others, while her own life remained as grey and unremarkable as the dress she wore. The commission that arrived 3 days later changed everything, though Eleanor did not know it at the time. Mrs. Pemberton summoned her to the front of the shop with unusual urgency, her elderly face flushed with an excitement that made her look almost girlish despite her 70 years. "Eleanor, my dear, you must sit down," Mrs. Pemberton said, gesturing to one of the velvet chairs reserved for wealthy clients. "I have just received the most extraordinary news." Eleanor remained standing, accustomed to her role as employee rather than guest in this establishment. "What has happened? The Duchess of Somerset has commissioned 3 gowns for the royal ball," Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice dropping to a reverent whisper, as though speaking of something sacred. 3 gowns, Eleanor. She specifically requested that you design and execute them personally. She saw Lady Montague's gown at the opera last week and made inquiries about the creator. When Lady Montague mentioned this establishment, the Duchess sent her personal secretary this very morning with the commission. Eleanor felt a strange sensation in her chest, something between exhilaration and terror. The Duchess of Somerset was one of the most influential women in London society, a close friend of the Queen herself. A commission from her could establish a dressmaker's reputation forever. It could also destroy it if the work proved unsatisfactory. "When is the ball?" Eleanor asked, her practical mind already cataloguing the work required. 3 weeks, Mrs. Pemberton said, and Eleanor's heart sank. 3 gowns of the quality the Duchess would expect in 3 weeks, while maintaining all of their other obligations. It was nearly impossible. "I will need to work day and night," Eleanor said slowly, "and I will require complete control over the designs and execution. No interference, no compromise on materials or technique." Mrs. Pemberton hesitated, and Eleanor understood her dilemma. The elderly woman was accustomed to taking credit for Eleanor's work, to presenting herself as the artistic genius behind the establishment's success. But this commission was too important to risk on pride. "You shall have everything you require," Mrs. Pemberton said finally. "Whatever you need, Eleanor, this is our opportunity to secure our place among London's premier dressmakers. Do not fail me." Eleanor spent the next 2 weeks in a state of focused intensity that left no room for sleep or rest, or any thought beyond fabric and form. She met with the Duchess of Somerset only once, a brief consultation during which the elegant older woman had studied Eleanor with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see far more than her station or appearance. "Mrs. Pemberton tells me you are responsible for all her finest work," the Duchess had said, her voice carrying the cultured accent of old aristocracy. "I wonder why I have never heard your name before." "I prefer to let my work speak for itself, Your Grace," Eleanor had replied, and the Duchess had smiled, a small, knowing expression that suggested she understood precisely what Eleanor was not saying. "Then let us see what your work has to say. I want 3 gowns, 1 for the opening reception, 1 for the ball itself, and 1 for the midnight supper. I want elegance, sophistication, and above all, I want something that demonstrates genuine artistry rather than mere ostentation. Can you provide that, Miss Hartley?" "Yes, Your Grace," Eleanor had said, and she had meant it with every fibre of her being. The gowns that emerged from those 2 weeks of obsessive labour were the finest Eleanor had ever created. The first was deep emerald silk with gold embroidery that caught light like treasure. The second was midnight blue velvet with pearl accents that created the illusion of stars scattered across a night sky. The third was champagne-coloured satin with such subtle beading that the gown seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. Each piece was a masterwork of design and craftsmanship, the kind of creation that transcended fashion and became art. Eleanor delivered them personally to the Duchess's residence in Mayfair, her heart pounding, with an anxiety that had nothing to do with social inadequacy and everything to do with professional pride. The Duchess received her in a private sitting room, examining each gown with the careful attention of a true connoisseur. "Extraordinary," the Duchess said finally, and Eleanor felt herself breathe for what seemed like the first time in days. "You have a genuine gift, Miss Hartley. These gowns are precisely what I had hoped for, elegant, sophisticated, and entirely unique. I shall be the envy of every woman at the ball." "Thank you, Your Grace," Eleanor said, preparing to depart now that her work was complete. "A moment, if you please," the Duchess said, her tone shifting to something more thoughtful. "This royal ball, it celebrates the return of 3 dukes from service abroad. The Duke of Ashford returns from military campaigns in the colonies, the Duke of Thornwick from diplomatic missions in Europe, and the Duke of Ravenscroft from his industrial ventures in the north. London society has been in a frenzy of speculation about which young ladies might capture their attention. It will be quite the spectacle." Eleanor nodded politely, unsure why the Duchess was sharing such information with a seamstress. "I was thinking," the Duchess continued, "that you should attend the ball." Eleanor stared at her, certain she had misheard. "Your Grace, I am a dressmaker, not a member of society. I could not possibly—" "Nonsense. You have more grace, intelligence, and genuine quality than half the simpering debutantes who will be in attendance. And besides, I have a particular interest in seeing your work displayed in the finest setting possible. You will attend as my guest, and I will hear no argument on the matter." The day of the ball arrived with the cruel irony of perfect weather. A rare November evening when London's infamous fog lifted to reveal stars brilliant against a black velvet sky. Eleanor had spent the morning making last-minute adjustments to one of the Duchess's gowns, her fingers steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with her needlework. She had tried repeatedly to decline the Duchess's invitation, but the older woman had proven as immovable as stone. A gown had been provided, one Eleanor herself had created months earlier for a client who had subsequently cancelled the order. It was a masterpiece of subtle elegance, dove-grey silk with silver threading that created patterns like frost on glass. It was, Eleanor realized with a mixture of pride and apprehension, perhaps the finest thing she had ever made. Mrs. Pemberton had granted her the evening off with ill-concealed resentment, clearly believing that Eleanor was overstepping her station. The other seamstresses had helped her dress with a mixture of genuine kindness and uncomfortable envy. And now, Eleanor stood in her tiny room above the baker's shop, staring at her reflection in the small mirror with a sense of unreality that bordered on dreamlike. The woman looking back at her was a stranger. The grey gown transformed her slender figure into something almost ethereal. Her dark hair, usually pulled back in a severe bun, had been arranged in a softer style that framed her face. She was not young, and she was not conventionally beautiful. Her features were too strong, her expression too intelligent for fashionable prettiness. But there was something in her bearing, something in the way she held herself, that suggested depths society had trained itself not to see in women like her. The Duchess's carriage arrived at 8 o'clock, and Eleanor descended into the November night, feeling as though she were stepping into someone else's life. The journey to Buckingham Palace passed in a blur of gaslit streets and growing traffic as London's elite converged on the royal residence. Eleanor sat in silence, her gloved hands folded in her lap, watching the city transform as they moved from middle-class Bloomsbury through increasingly wealthy neighbourhoods until they reached the magnificent facade of the palace itself. The entrance hall was a revelation of marble and gold, of towering columns and crystal chandeliers that turned night into brilliant day. Eleanor followed the Duchess through corridors thronged with London's highest society, women in gowns that represented fortunes, men in evening dress that spoke of old money and older titles. The air was thick with expensive perfume, and the murmur of 1,000 conversations conducted in the carefully modulated tones of the aristocracy. The ballroom itself defied description. It was vast beyond Eleanor's imagining, its ceiling lost in painted glory somewhere far above, its walls lined with mirrors that multiplied the already overwhelming crowd into infinity. An orchestra played from a gallery, the music soaring over the din of voices. Everywhere Eleanor looked, she saw wealth, privilege, beauty deployed as weapon and armor in the endless social warfare of high society. And there, near the far wall, she saw Beatrice and Lavinia. Her stepmother was resplendent in purple silk, diamonds glittering at her throat like captured stars. Lavinia wore the pink gown Eleanor had created, and she looked lovely, young and fresh, and exactly the kind of conventional beauty that society celebrated. They had not yet noticed Eleanor, and she felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment at remaining invisible even here. The Duchess touched Eleanor's arm gently. "You look as though you're preparing for battle rather than a ball. Remember, my dear, you belong here as much as anyone, more than most if we're measuring by character rather than circumstance." Before Eleanor could respond, a hush fell over the ballroom. The orchestra ceased playing, and all eyes turned toward the main entrance where 3 men had appeared, announced by a royal herald with ceremonial flourish. His Grace, the Duke of Ashford, His Grace, the Duke of Thornwick, His Grace, the Duke of Ravenscroft. The 3 dukes entered together, and even Eleanor, who knew nothing of military campaigns or diplomatic triumphs, could feel the weight of their presence. The Duke of Ashford was tall and broad-shouldered, his military bearing evident in every movement. A scar traced the line of his jaw, and his eyes held the distant look of a man who had seen too much violence. The Duke of Thornwick was slighter, more refined, with the sharp features and observant gaze of a scholar or strategist. The Duke of Ravenscroft was the most striking, dark-haired and charismatic, with an energy that seemed barely contained by the formal constraints of evening dress. Within moments, they were surrounded by London's most ambitious mothers and their hopeful daughters. Eleanor watched the spectacle with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying tribal rituals. She saw Beatrice pushing Lavinia forward, saw a dozen other families employing similar strategies. The three dukes maintained expressions of polite interest, but Eleanor thought she detected something else beneath their social masks. Weariness, perhaps, or a kind of resigned cynicism about the theatre in which they were forced to perform. The music resumed and the dancing began. Eleanor retreated to the periphery of the ballroom, content to observe rather than participate. She found a quiet alcove near one of the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens, grateful for a moment of relative solitude in which to process the overwhelming sensory assault of the evening. She was studying the gardens, visible in patches through the fog that was beginning to creep back across London, when a voice spoke beside her. "Seeking refuge from the carnival, I see." Eleanor turned to find one of the dukes standing beside her, the Duke of Thornwick, she thought, based on his scholarly appearance. Up close, she could see intelligence burning in his grey eyes, and something else, a kind of amused exhaustion with the evening's proceedings. "I did not mean to intrude on your solitude, Your Grace," Eleanor said, preparing to withdraw. "Please don't go. It's rare to find another soul at these events who looks as though they're thinking rather than merely performing." He studied her with open curiosity. "I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm quite certain I would remember if we had been." "We have not been introduced, Your Grace. I am not—" Eleanor hesitated, unsure how to explain her presence. "I am not formally part of society. I am here as the guest of the Duchess of Somerset." "Ah, the Duchess. A woman of exceptional judgment and rather alarming perceptiveness. If she has brought you here, then you must be someone worth knowing." He gestured to the ballroom behind them. "Tell me, what do you make of this magnificent display of aristocratic ritual?" Eleanor knew she should offer some platitude, some safe observation that would offend no one and reveal nothing. But there was something in the Duke's manner, a genuine quality that suggested he was actually interested in her answer, rather than merely filling silence with conversation. "It reminds me of a dressmaker's workshop," she said finally. "Everyone wearing their finest creations, hoping to be noticed, to be chosen, to be declared successful by whatever arbitrary standard has been established. The primary difference is that in a workshop, at least the pretense of productivity exists." The Duke laughed, a genuine sound of delight that turned several heads in their direction. "A dressmaker's workshop, that is perfect. You must be a philosopher to see through society's illusions so clearly." "I am a dressmaker, actually," Eleanor said. "I see through these illusions because I help create them. Every gown in this room represents a carefully constructed fantasy about wealth, taste, and desirability. I know precisely how much artifice goes into appearing natural." The Duke's expression shifted to something more intrigued. "A dressmaker and a philosopher. How refreshing. Tell me, what is your name? I find I very much wish to continue this conversation, and it seems foolish to do so without proper introduction." "Eleanor Hartley. A pleasure to make your acquaintance, Miss Hartley. I am—" "The Duke of Thornwick, I know. Your arrival was rather ceremoniously announced. Please, call me James. At least when we're tucked away in alcoves escaping the madness. Your Grace and Miss Hartley seem absurdly formal for two people who have already begun dismantling the pretensions of the aristocracy." They talked for nearly an hour, their conversation ranging from art to literature to politics, with the easy flow of genuinely compatible minds. Eleanor found herself forgetting to be cautious, forgetting to maintain the careful deference appropriate to their respective stations. James, the Duke of Thornwick, treated her as an intellectual equal, seeking her opinions and challenging her ideas with the enthusiasm of someone starved for authentic discourse. "You've travelled extensively, I understand," Eleanor said, when their conversation turned to his diplomatic work. "What is it like seeing so much of the world?" "Exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure," James said. "Every country believes itself superior to all others, and convincing them to cooperate requires navigating 1,000 petty vanities and ancient grudges. But occasionally, just occasionally, you encounter someone who sees beyond their own borders, who understands that we're all struggling with the same fundamental human questions, regardless of language or culture. Those moments make the rest tolerable." "And now you've returned to London, where the struggles are considerably less grand," Eleanor observed. "Indeed, from negotiating peace treaties to navigating ballroom politics, I'm not certain which requires more delicate maneuvering." He paused, studying her with that penetrating gaze. "You're quite unlike anyone else I've met this evening, Miss Hartley. Unlike anyone I've met in a very long time, actually. There's something genuine about you. It's rather remarkable in a setting where authenticity is the rarest commodity." Before Eleanor could respond, the Duke of Ashford approached their alcove, his military bearing somehow more pronounced in the civilian setting. "Thornwick, there you are. I've been looking for—" He stopped, his attention shifting to Eleanor with sudden focus. "Forgive the interruption." "Not at all," James said. "Allow me to introduce Miss Eleanor Hartley." "Eleanor, this is the Duke of Ashford." Alexander, if you can believe his parents saddled him with such a grandiose name. The Duke of Ashford, Alexander, bowed slightly, and Eleanor saw his eyes taking in every detail of her appearance with the assessing gaze of a military strategist. "Miss Hartley, James is notoriously difficult to pin down at these events. You must be extraordinary company to have kept him engaged for so long." "Miss Hartley is a philosopher disguised as a dressmaker," James said. "We've been deconstructing the anthropology of ballroom culture. It's been the most intellectually stimulating conversation I've had in months." "A dressmaker," Alexander repeated, and something in his expression shifted, not with disdain but with interest. "That's an unusual profession for someone attending a royal ball." "I'm here as the Duchess of Somerset's guest," Eleanor explained. "I created her gowns for this evening." Alexander's gaze sharpened. "The emerald gown, that's your work?" When Eleanor nodded, he continued, "It's extraordinary. The Duchess has been the subject of considerable attention this evening, and that gown is the reason. You have remarkable talent, Miss Hartley." The conversation was interrupted by the orchestra striking up a waltz. Alexander extended his hand to Eleanor with the kind of instinctive courtesy that spoke of deep-bred manners. "Would you do me the honor of this dance, Miss Hartley?" Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse. She had not danced in years, and certainly never with a duke. But something in Alexander's expression, a kind of quiet insistence that suggested he would not accept rejection, made her place her hand in his. The moment they stepped onto the dance floor, Eleanor felt the ballroom's attention shift toward them like a physical force. Conversations faltered, heads turned. The Duke of Ashford, one of England's most celebrated military heroes, was dancing with an unknown woman while 100 ambitious mothers watched their carefully laid plans crumble. Alexander was an excellent dancer, his movements confident and precise. He guided Eleanor through the waltz with effortless skill, and she found herself relaxing into the rhythm despite the weight of scrutiny pressing down on them. "You dance beautifully," Alexander said, "though you look as though you're preparing for an ambush." "I feel as though I'm at the center of one," Eleanor admitted. "Everyone is staring. Let them stare. I've faced cavalry charges and artillery fire. A few disapproving matrons hold no terror for me." His expression softened slightly. "You're uncomfortable with the attention." "I'm unused to attention of any kind, Your Grace. I'm accustomed to being invisible." "Alexander, please. And you are far from invisible, Miss Hartley. You have a quality that draws the eye, a kind of self-possession that is remarkably rare, especially among women who have been trained from birth to seek approval and validation from others." Across the ballroom, Eleanor caught sight of Beatrice's face, frozen in an expression of shock so complete it would have been comical in any other circumstance. Lavinia stood beside her mother, her pretty features twisted with confusion and resentment. They had seen her. After years of rendering Eleanor invisible through sheer force of contempt, they could no longer deny her existence. The waltz ended, but before Eleanor could escape back to obscurity, the Duke of Ravenscroft appeared at her side. He was even more striking up close, his dark eyes full of barely contained energy and what looked like genuine amusement. "Ashford, Thornwick, you cannot monopolize this fascinating woman all evening. It's terribly unsporting." He turned to Eleanor with a smile that probably devastated debutantes on a regular basis. "I am the Duke of Ravenscroft, William to my friends, which I very much hope you will become, and you must be the mysterious Miss Hartley who has captivated my fellow dukes so completely. I'm quite desperately curious about you." The next hour passed in a blur of conversation and dancing. All three dukes seemed determined to claim Eleanor's attention, engaging her in discussions that ranged from politics to art to the nature of progress itself. William, the Duke of Ravenscroft, spoke passionately about industrial reform and the responsibilities of wealth. Alexander shared observations about human nature gleaned from military service. James discussed philosophy and literature with the enthusiasm of a true scholar. Eleanor found herself responding with an honesty and intellectual engagement she had not experienced in years. These men treated her as an equal, valuing her opinions and challenging her ideas with genuine respect. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure, not because of their titles or wealth, but because it reminded her of what she had lost when her father died, when Beatrice had stripped away not just her inheritance, but her sense of belonging in the world of ideas and conversation. The ballroom buzzed with speculation. Who was this woman? Where had she come from? How had she captured the attention of all three dukes while the most eligible young ladies of London society were left to watch in shocked dismay? Eleanor could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on her from every direction, but the presence of the three dukes created a protective barrier that society's disapproval could not penetrate. It was nearly midnight when Beatrice finally gathered enough courage, or rage, to confront the situation directly. Eleanor was standing with the three dukes near one of the ballroom's magnificent fireplaces, discussing the latest novels, when her stepmother's voice cut through the conversation like shattered glass. "Eleanor, what are you doing here?" The question was loud enough to silence nearby conversations, creating a spreading pool of quiet that eventually encompassed the entire ballroom. The orchestra continued playing, but everyone had stopped dancing to watch the unfolding drama. Eleanor turned slowly to face Beatrice, whose face was mottled with fury and humiliation. Lavinia stood behind her mother, looking simultaneously vindictive and uncertain. "Good evening, Beatrice," Eleanor said, her voice calm despite the hammering of her heart. "I am attending the ball as the Duchess of Somerset's guest." "As her guest?" Beatrice's laugh was harsh and theatrical. "Don't be absurd. You are a seamstress, a servant. You have no place among decent society. You are here under false pretenses, deceiving these gentlemen about your true nature and station." The three dukes had gone very still beside Eleanor, their expressions shifting from surprise to something darker and more dangerous. But before any of them could speak, Eleanor stepped forward slightly, drawing Beatrice's venom toward herself. "I have never deceived anyone about who or what I am," Eleanor said clearly. "I am indeed a dressmaker. I earned my place here through my craft, which is more than can be said for those who rely solely on inherited wealth and married titles." Beatrice's face darkened further. "How dare you speak to me with such insolence? After everything my late husband did for you, this is how you repay his memory, by embarrassing his widow at a royal ball." She turned to the watching crowd, playing to them with practiced skill. "This woman is my stepdaughter, a spinster of 37 who has failed at every opportunity life has offered her. She is unmarried, penniless, and surviving only through the charity of her employer. No gentleman wants a woman of her age and circumstances. She is here tonight out of desperate delusion, attempting to present herself as something she is not." The words landed like blows, each one calculated to humiliate and diminish. Eleanor felt the familiar shame rising in her chest, that old poisonous voice that whispered Beatrice was right, that she was a failure, that she deserved contempt and obscurity. But then James, the Duke of Thornwick, stepped forward, and his voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of absolute authority. "Madam, you speak of Miss Hartley as though her profession diminishes her worth. I would suggest that creating beauty through skill and artistry represents a far nobler pursuit than merely inheriting wealth and spending it on self-aggrandizement." His grey eyes were cold as winter. "Miss Hartley has demonstrated more intelligence, grace, and genuine quality in one evening than I have encountered in a month of social obligations. If anyone in this ballroom should be embarrassed, it is certainly not her." Alexander moved to Eleanor's other side, his military bearing transformed into something formidable. "I have fought beside soldiers of every class and background. I have learned that character and courage have nothing to do with birth or fortune. Miss Hartley possesses both in abundance, which is considerably more than can be said for those who seek to shame her for circumstances beyond her control." William completed the protective formation, his usual charm replaced by steel. "The true measure of a person lies in how they treat those whom society has taught them to consider inferior. By that measure, madam, you have revealed yourself quite thoroughly this evening, and the revelation is not flattering." The ballroom had gone absolutely silent. Even the orchestra had stopped playing. Every eye was fixed on the confrontation unfolding before them. The three most eligible men in England publicly defending an unknown dressmaker against the attacks of a woman who represented everything London society claimed to value. Beatrice's face had gone from red to pale, understanding beginning to dawn that she had miscalculated catastrophically. Lavinia looked as though she might cry, realizing that her mother's attack had just destroyed any chance she might have had with the dukes. The Duchess of Somerset appeared then, moving through the crowd with the regal authority of someone accustomed to command. She placed a hand on Eleanor's shoulder, a gesture of unmistakable support and affiliation. "Miss Hartley is my personal guest," the Duchess said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. "I invited her because she possesses remarkable talent and admirable character. Anyone who questions my judgment in this matter is welcome to express their concerns directly to me, though I suspect they will find the conversation rather uncomfortable." The weight of the Duchess's endorsement, combined with the public support of 3 dukes, was devastating. Beatrice opened her mouth as though to continue her attack, then closed it again, recognizing defeat. She turned and fled the ballroom with as much dignity as she could muster, dragging Lavinia behind her. The orchestra resumed playing. Conversation started again, though now Eleanor was their primary subject. But the tone had changed. Instead of contemptuous dismissal, there was curiosity, speculation, and a grudging respect. The 3 dukes had declared her worthy of their attention, and society, for all its snobbery, knew better than to contradict such powerful arbiters of taste. Eleanor stood at the center of it all, feeling simultaneously exposed and protected, humiliated and vindicated. James offered her his arm with a gentle smile. "Perhaps we should retire to the Duchess's salon for a moment. I suspect you could use a respite from public scrutiny." The Duchess led them to a private sitting room off the main ballroom, a smaller space decorated in blue silk and gold that felt blessedly quiet after the overwhelming noise of the ball. Eleanor sank into a chair, her hands trembling slightly now that the immediate crisis had passed. "I apologize for that scene," she said. "I never intended to create such a spectacle, or to embarrass any of you by association." "Embarrass us?" William laughed, though his expression was kind. "Miss Hartley, you have nothing to apologize for. That woman's cruelty revealed only her own character, not yours, and frankly I found the entire confrontation rather satisfying. It's rare that one gets to demolish social hypocrisy so publicly." "Beatrice has always been cruel," Eleanor said quietly. "She married my father for his modest fortune, and when he died she ensured I received nothing. I have supported myself through my work ever since. Tonight was simply another variation on familiar themes, her need to remind me that I have failed to meet society's expectations of what a woman should be." The Duchess settled into a chair beside Eleanor. "My dear, society's expectations are designed to keep women small, silent, and dependent. The fact that you have carved out an independent existence through talent and determination is not failure, it is triumph. And tonight, you have demonstrated something even more important, that your worth is not determined by age, marriage, or the approval of small-minded people who cannot see past their own prejudices." "The Duchess is quite right," James said. "You are extraordinary, Miss Hartley. Your intelligence, your honesty, your refusal to diminish yourself to satisfy others' expectations, these are rare qualities and they have nothing to do with whether you're 20 or 40 or 70. Alexander nodded. "I spent years in military service, surrounded by men who proved their worth through action rather than circumstance. You remind me of the best of them, people who understood that character is forged through adversity, not inherited through bloodlines." The conversation continued for another hour, ranging from the personal to the philosophical. Eleanor found herself opening up about her life, her father's death, her stepmother's cruelty, her years of solitary work, and the strange mixture of pride and loneliness that came from independence achieved through necessity rather than choice. The 3 dukes listened with genuine attention, asking thoughtful questions and sharing their own experiences of isolation and expectation. It was nearly 2 in the morning when the Duchess's carriage finally returned Eleanor to her modest room above the baker's shop. She climbed the narrow stairs in the grey gown that had transformed her life for one evening, her mind spinning with the impossibility of everything that had happened. She should have felt triumphant. She had faced down Beatrice's cruelty with dignity. She had earned the public support of the Duchess of Somerset and 3 of England's most powerful men. Society would now see her differently, whether they wished to or not. But as Eleanor carefully removed the grey gown and hung it in her tiny wardrobe, what she felt most strongly was a kind of melancholy recognition. The ball had been a temporary reprieve, a single evening when the rules that governed her life had been temporarily suspended. Tomorrow she would return to Mrs. Pemberton's shop. She would resume her work as a seamstress, creating beauty for others, while her own life remained as constrained as ever. The attention of 3 dukes, however genuine in the moment, could not change the fundamental realities of her existence. She was still 37, still unmarried, still without fortune or family protection, One magical evening could not rewrite the story society had already written for her. Eleanor lay in bed as dawn began to grey her small window, and she allowed herself to remember every moment of the ball. The conversations, the dancing, the feeling of being seen and valued as herself, rather than merely tolerated or scorned. She would treasure the memory, but she would not fool herself into believing it represented any kind of lasting change. She was wrong about that, as it turned out. The morning brought a series of visitors that transformed her understanding of what the previous evening had meant. The first to arrive was a messenger from the Duchess of Somerset, bearing an invitation to tea that afternoon. The second was a messenger from the Duke of Thornwick, requesting permission to call upon her at her earliest convenience. The third was from the Duke of Ashford, asking if she would join him for a walk in Hyde Park the following day. The fourth was from the Duke of Ravenscroft, inviting her to tour his textile factory to discuss potential collaboration on workers' clothing designs. Mrs. Pemberton, who had answered the door for all four messengers, looked at Eleanor with an expression that mixed astonishment, resentment, and a kind of calculating speculation. "What happened at that ball?" she demanded. Eleanor could only shake her head, as bewildered as her employer. "I honestly don't know." The next 2 weeks were unlike anything Eleanor had experienced. All three dukes pursued her attention with a determination that shocked London society and delighted the gossip columns. They called upon her at the shop, interrupting her work with flowers and conversation. They invited her to respectable public outings, walks in parks, visits to museums, attendance at concerts. They treated her as though she were a woman of consequence, rather than a seamstress surviving on modest wages. More astonishing than their attention was the shift in how society responded to her. The Duchess of Somerset's patronage, combined with the Duke's obvious interest, had transformed Eleanor from invisible servant to intriguing curiosity. Suddenly, the ladies who had never glanced twice at her wanted to know her opinions on fashion. Invitations began arriving to social events she would never have been considered worthy to attend before the ball. Most shocking of all was the change in Beatrice and Lavinia's circumstances. Their attack on Eleanor had been witnessed by everyone who mattered in London society, and the verdict was unanimous. Beatrice had revealed herself as cruel and petty, motivated by jealousy rather than propriety. Invitations that had once been assured now failed to arrive. Lavinia's prospects, which had seemed so certain before the ball, evaporated, as young men recognized that aligning themselves with a family known for public cruelty would be social suicide. Eleanor learned all this through Mrs. Pemberton, who received society gossip through her wealthy clients. The elderly woman had initially been furious that Eleanor had attended the ball without informing her, but the subsequent flood of commissions from ladies wanting gowns by the seamstress who captured the Duke's attention had transformed her anger into delighted calculation. She raised Eleanor's wages and began introducing her to clients as the establishment's chief designer, a title Eleanor had earned years ago but had never been granted until it became profitable to do so. Through it all, Eleanor tried to maintain her equilibrium. She accepted the Duke's invitations because refusing would have been impossibly rude, but she guarded her heart carefully. They were kind, intelligent, and genuinely seemed to value her company. But she could not forget that they were dukes, men of immense wealth and power who existed in a world completely removed from her own reality. Until the afternoon when James, the Duke of Thornwick, arrived at the shop with a proposal that changed everything. "Walk with me," he said, and something in his expression told Eleanor this was not a casual invitation. They walked through Bloomsbury's quiet streets, the November air sharp with approaching winter. James was silent for several minutes, and Eleanor let him gather his thoughts, recognizing the signs of someone preparing to say something difficult. "I have spent the last 2 weeks thinking about you constantly," James said finally, "about our conversation at the ball, about everything we've discussed since then, about who you are and what you represent in a world that desperately needs people like you, people with integrity, intelligence, and the courage to be genuine, even when it would be easier to perform." "James," Eleanor began, but he raised a hand gently. "Let me finish, please. I am not a romantic man by nature. I approach life rationally, analyzing situations and making decisions based on logic rather than emotion. But you have utterly disrupted my usual approach. You have made me feel things I wasn't certain I was capable of feeling, and I find myself wanting to know everything about you. Your thoughts, your dreams, your opinions on matters both profound and trivial." He stopped walking and turned to face her directly. "I'm asking for permission to court you properly, Eleanor. Not as a curiosity or a diversion, but as a woman I am coming to care for deeply. I want to know if what I feel might be reciprocated, and I want to explore the possibility of building something genuine between us." Eleanor's throat tightened with emotion. "I don't understand why you would want this. I am 37 years old, I have no fortune, no family, no—" "You have yourself," James interrupted firmly. "You have your brilliant mind, your artistic talent, your hard-won wisdom. You have survived years of cruelty with your character intact. You have built a life through your own efforts when many would have simply surrendered. These are what make you valuable. Your age is irrelevant. Your lack of fortune is meaningless. What matters is who you are, and who you are is someone I want to know better." Similar conversations followed with Alexander and William over the next few days. Each duke approached her with respect and genuine affection, explaining why they valued her and asking permission to court her properly. It was overwhelming and touching and terrifying all at once. Eleanor found herself in the impossible position of having 3 extraordinary men interested in her when she had spent years believing no one would ever see her as worthy of romantic consideration. She had to make a choice, but she also had to first understand what she wanted, not what society expected, not what would be most practical, but what her own heart desired. She spent hours walking through London streets, thinking about the 3 men who had inexplicably entered her life. James, with his sharp intellect and philosophical bent; Alexander, with his quiet strength and deep-rooted integrity; William, with his passionate idealism and reformer's zeal. Each of them extraordinary, each of them genuine, each of them treating her as an equal rather than a prize to be won. The choice, Eleanor realized, was not about selecting the most advantageous match. It was about determining with whom she could build the kind of partnership she had always imagined but had stopped believing possible. It was about recognizing which connection felt most natural, most comfortable, most like coming home after years of exile. She made her decision on a cold December morning, standing in the shop workroom surrounded by silks and satins, her hands resting on fabric the way a musician's hands rest on an instrument. This was who she was: a creator, an artist, someone who found meaning in work and beauty in precision. She needed someone who understood that, who valued it, who would support her continuing to be herself rather than expecting her to transform into some conventional idea of a duchess. She invited all 3 dukes to tea at a small cafe near the British Museum, wanting to handle this with honesty and directness rather than the elaborate social maneuvering that London society would have expected. They arrived within minutes of each other, and if they were surprised to find themselves together, they hid it well. "I asked you all here because I owe you honesty," Eleanor said once they were seated. "These past weeks have been extraordinary. You have each shown me kindness, respect, and genuine affection. You have made me feel valued in ways I had stopped believing possible, and you deserve to know my decision without games or manipulation." She turned to James. "You were the first person I connected with at the ball, and that conversation felt like finding water after years of thirst. I love how you see the world, through the lens of ideas and philosophy, always searching for deeper meaning. You challenge me intellectually in ways I desperately need." Then to William: "Your passion for reform, your conviction that privilege carries responsibility, these things resonate with everything I believe. You make me feel as though the work I do matters, that creating beautiful things for ordinary people has value beyond mere commerce." Finally, to Alexander: "Your quiet strength, your understanding of survival and resilience, these speak to something fundamental in me. You see the courage it takes simply to keep going when everything seems designed to break you." All 3 men watched her with expressions that mixed hope and apprehension, and Eleanor felt the weight of what she was about to do, choosing one path while closing off others. "I care for all of you," she said quietly, "but I find myself drawn most strongly to James. Not because he is better than either of you, but because when I imagine building a life with someone, when I imagine the kind of partnership that would fulfill me rather than diminish me, I imagine it with him." There was a moment of heavy silence. Then William smiled, a genuine expression without bitterness. "I cannot say I'm not disappointed, but I respect your choice, and I'm glad James will have the opportunity to spend his life with someone as remarkable as you." Alexander nodded. "Thornwick is a fortunate man. I hope he appreciates what he's being given, the chance to build something genuine with someone who refuses to be anything less than herself." James looked at Eleanor with an expression of such profound emotion that it made her chest tighten. "I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve this," he said quietly. The engagement was announced a month later, and if London society was shocked by a duke marrying a 37-year-old seamstress, they were wise enough not to express their disapproval too loudly. The Duchess of Somerset's continued patronage, combined with Alexander and William's vocal support of the match, made it clear that criticizing Eleanor or her marriage would have consequences. The wedding took place in early spring, a small ceremony attended by close friends, rather than the elaborate social spectacle that would have been traditional. Eleanor wore a gown of her own creation, ivory silk, with silver embroidery that caught light like captured stars. As she stood beside James, exchanging vows that promised partnership and mutual respect, rather than obedience and subordination, she felt something shift inside her, a loosening of the fear and shame that had constrained her for so long. Her life transformed, but not in the ways London society would have expected. James did not expect her to abandon her work or transform into a conventional duchess. Instead, he encouraged her to expand her ambitions. With his support and William's business expertise, Eleanor established her own design house, a workshop that employed women in circumstances similar to her former situation, paying fair wages and teaching valuable skills. She used her new position not to join society's upper echelons but to challenge them. She spoke publicly about women's economic independence, about the artificial limitations society placed on female ambition, about the cruelty of judging people by age or circumstance rather than character. She was not universally liked. In fact, she was frequently criticized as too forward, too unconventional, too willing to upset established order, but she was respected, and more importantly, she was herself, fully, completely, without apology or diminishment. 2 years after the ball that had changed her life, Eleanor stood in her design house, watching her seamstresses work on a commission for the Queen herself. The workshop was filled with light and laughter, a stark contrast to the dim, silent workroom of Mrs. Pemberton's establishment, where she had labored in obscurity. James arrived in the late afternoon, as he often did, bringing tea and settling into a chair to watch her work. This had become their ritual. He would read or work on correspondence while she created, the two of them existing comfortably in shared space without the need for constant conversation. "I received a letter from Lavinia today," Eleanor said, not looking up from her sketching. "Apparently, Beatrice has fallen on difficult times, some bad investments, and the social ostracism has taken its toll. Lavinia is asking if I might consider employing her as a seamstress." James looked up from his papers. "That takes considerable courage given how they treated you, or considerable desperation." Eleanor set down her pencil and considered the request. "What do you think I should do?" "I think you should do whatever feels right to you. You've earned the right to decide who deserves your generosity and who does not." Eleanor thought about Beatrice's cruelty, about years of mockery and shame. She thought about how satisfying it would be to refuse, to let Lavinia experience the same helplessness and humiliation Eleanor had endured. But she also thought about the woman she had become, not despite the cruelty, but in some strange way because of it. She had learned compassion through suffering. She had learned resilience through adversity. She had learned that cruelty diminished the person who wielded it far more than its victims. "I'll offer her a position," Eleanor said finally. "Not out of forgiveness exactly, but because I remember what it feels like to have no options, no prospects, no one willing to take a chance on you. I don't want to be the person who perpetuates that cycle, even when it would be justified." James smiled. "This is why I fell in love with you. Your refusal to let bitterness corrupt your character, even when bitterness would be entirely understandable." Eleanor crossed to where he sat and kissed him gently. "I fell in love with you because you saw me when I had become very skilled at being invisible. You looked past every reason society gave you to dismiss me, and you saw someone worth knowing." As evening settled over London, Eleanor returned to her work, James reading quietly beside her. Through the workshop windows, she could see the city transformed by gaslight, its streets alive with the eternal movement of people pursuing their own dreams and struggles. Somewhere out there, Lavinia was facing an uncertain future. Somewhere other women like Eleanor, women deemed too old, too poor, too unmarried to matter, were fighting their own battles for dignity and survival. Eleanor could not save all of them, but she could create opportunities where none had existed. She could demonstrate through her own life that society's judgments were neither final nor accurate. She could prove that worth had nothing to do with age or circumstance, and everything to do with character and courage, and the refusal to accept diminishment as inevitable. The story that had begun with a stepmother's cruelty and a ballroom confrontation had become something far more significant, not a fairy tale about rescue or transformation, but a more complex narrative about self-determination, resilience, and the quiet revolutionary act of being fully oneself in a world designed to keep women small. Eleanor Hartley had spent 37 years learning to survive. At 39, she was finally learning to thrive, and she was doing it on her own terms, with a partner who valued her autonomy as much as her affection, in a life she had built through talent, determination, and an unshakable conviction that she deserved more than society had decreed for women like her. It was not the ending Beatrice had predicted on that rainy night in the dressmaking shop, but it was the ending Eleanor had earned, and that made it the most satisfying conclusion of all.